A lot of people will tell you that if you want to be a writer, you need to be a reader. And when they tell you this, they're telling you that the experience of just reading will help you with being able to just write. Of course, that's about as specific as it gets. They just tell you to go read stuff without telling you what to read, how to read, why to read. And frankly, I do this in my freshman writing classes when I'm trying to teach people how to be college writers and do academic reading. I often tell them in order to become a good academic writer, you need to be a good academic reader and you need to read academic work in order to help you with your language, help you with your vocabulary, help you with your ability to form arguments and to craft papers that engage readers. It is true that being a reader helps you be a writer. But since this is creative writing, I'd like us to think a little bit about what that means exactly. What should we read? Why should we read? And how should we read? And what does that do for our creative writing when we set out with an empty page to try to write something, a poem, a play, a story for another reader? When we want to create a cartoon, a meme, a comic, what do we think about as we are writing? And how does reading help us do that? I'm going to give you an example here. And this is a weird example to start with because it's a song, it's lyrics. But I want to show you how we might listen to a song and we might tap our foot and we might really enjoy it or not. And whether or not you enjoy the Bare Naked Ladies, which is what I'm going to be playing a song from, is just a matter of your own personal taste. But as a writer, listening to lyrics, trying to figure out lyrics, being able to see how and why they have an effect on you is important. So I'm going to play a little bit of a song here, and the lyrics are there up on the screen. And then we'll talk about what does a writer think?
If I had $1 million, if I had $1 million, well, I'd buy you a house. I would buy you a house. And if I had $1 million, if I had $1 million, buy you furniture for your house, maybe a nice Chesterfield or an ottoman. And if I had $1 million, if I had $1 million, well, I'd buy you a K car, a nice reliant automobile. And if I had $1 million, I'd buy your love. If I had $1 million,
Okay, let's talk about the writing here. Because, whether or not you can play an instrument or whether or not you can sing, and you don't want me to try to sing this song for you, the writing itself is doing something pretty interesting here, and it's building this sense of a song that makes the song really enjoyable. First, it's kind of funny. If I had $1 million, I'd buy you a house. I'd buy furniture for your house. I'd buy you a K car. It's kind of funny just on its very surface level, but then you've got the bouncing voices behind it. But what is it doing with the writing? Well, the writing has a lot of repetition. $1 million, buy you a house, buy you a house, buy you furniture for your house. There's a lot of repetition in here that's engaging us as listeners or as readers. But I want to make a particular notice of the third stanza here. And if I had $1 million, well, I'd buy you a K car, a nice reliant automobile. There's a cleverness in this writing, and this is, of course, this isn't Shakespeare. This isn't brilliant writing that's going to stand the test of time. Although this song has stood up for a long time, but well, I'd buy you a K car. I've got an image here on the screen of a K car. It's not exactly a glamorous car. And in the next line, and a nice reliant automobile, it's playing both on the name of the car and what a car is and what you're doing with $1 million isn't anything really special. It's just like providing basic needs, a nice reliant automobile. what happens with setting up this clever little line, a K car, a nice reliant automobile, is it then moves into the next sentence in the stanza. And if I had $1 million, I'd buy your love. You know, whether or not you want somebody to buy your love or not, it's a really clever, moving kind of sentiment there as we move from buying a house to buying a Chesterfield to buying a K car and then buying your love. As a writer, looking at lyrics like this, you can begin to think about, okay, well, what did the writer here do in order to make this writing meaningful for me as the listener? And why should you do that? Well, because you want to be able to have the same kind of effect on your readers. Let's look at the next slide here and think about, what did this Sandra Boynton book that I had you read do for you as a writer? Well, I had you read it and watch it, but let's read the words here. A cat and two rats are trying on hats, but not the hippopotamus. A moose and a goose together have juice, but not the hippopotamus. This book is made up of couplets, rhyming couplets with very simple rhymes, of course, because it's for babies or for toddlers. It used to make my toddlers laugh nonstop about that poor little hippopotamus who could get nobody to love him or her. I don't want to genderize the hippopotamus. But what's happening here with the language is both a silliness, but also a tempo and a rhyming scheme that is bringing the reader along. Remember the 3 or 4-year-old reader, but also the people that read it. You can read this and have an effect when you read it because of the tempo and the rhyme and the repetition of, but not the hippopotamus. We love Sandra Boynton because of her drawing, and her drawing is hilarious, and it often ties in with the language very well. But really, I think we don't pay enough attention to what a strong writer she is when she can bring us into a story like this just with tempo and rhyme and make us care. And what's really important here is to notice we're not talking at all about the meaning, the whether or not this is a story about isolation or loneliness or wanting to feel like everybody else. We're just talking about the sounds of the words and how they bring us along. As writers, when we think about the sounds of our words and how they affect other people, we are starting to do writing at a deeper level than just typing a bunch of words on a page. What else does writing do for us? Well, I had you read some Shakespeare, and I had you read a very famous scene from Shakespeare, what's often called the balcony scene, even though there's no balcony. It's the scene where Juliet appears in a window and Romeo is thinking about her and talking and ends up talking to her. I want to read the words here. This is from Romeo's soliloquy under Juliet's window, and then I will talk about what we get out of this as writers. The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. I'm not as good as an actor as the actor was in the video that we saw, but I do love reading Shakespeare because Shakespeare has the tempo and the rhythm, as Sandra Boynton does, has some rhyme scheme and some language games, as Boynton does. But man, there is such a depth here, and I just want to show you all the things we can learn from reading Shakespeare and reading Shakespeare closely. In the very first line, we learn about description and what it means to describe things with fresh words. We don't just hear about a rosy cheek or a puff or a soft cheek. We hear about a bright cheek, the brightness of the cheek that would shame those stars. That second part of the sentence is a personification, as if stars had shame, or as if the cheek meant to shame the stars. In the next line, as daylight doth a lamp, daylight shaming lamps because it's so bright. It's a simile. It's a simile that has an image that gives us meaning. And then in the next part of that line, her eyes in heaven is figurative. It's using this figurative language, imagining these eyes in heaven that would through the airy region stream so bright as if her eyes were part of heaven. The next part line, would through the airy region, is an enjambment, and it's a poetic device where you finish you go through one line and then you finish in the next line. It's not a complete thought in the first line. But what's important about enjambment is how we break the line. Her eyes in heaven stops at this very important word heaven and then goes on to the next part. The next line, that birds would sing and think it were not night, has amplification. It's amplifying this meaning. Her eyes are not only are in heaven, but it's darkening heaven. Her eyes are so bright that they are become the light within heaven. And then, of course, there's the rhyme, bright night. I think it's worth pointing out here, too, that Shakespeare has a dominant rhythm throughout his language, but he only occasionally uses rhymes, particularly in the plays, to make us feel more the language. It's a very tight use of rhyme rather than using it in every line. We move from this great figurative, emotional, poetic device, all these poetic devices, to the next three lines that are much more physical. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand? It's narrative action. It brings us back into the story. And then this rhetorical exclamation, this thing that makes us feel the love that Romeo is feeling. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand. And this very last detail is a sensual detail. We can feel the sensuality, the sexuality of this moment, that I might touch that cheek. As writers reading these words, we free up our language. We free up our ability to say things with our language so that everything is not just straightforward, I like her, but I love to think about her eyes brightening heaven and being a glove upon her hand so that I could touch her cheek. There's such cleverness and beauty in those lines. And as writers, we can learn a lot about how to bring that cleverness and beauty into our own writing when we read Shakespeare. It takes work, of course. It took a lot of work for me to even just break it down for you like this. It takes work to do this reading, but it's worth it. It brings such depth to your language as you begin to do your own creative writing. Take you to the Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. It's a really clever little story. It happens just within a few paragraphs. And I want to just read these two and a half paragraphs out loud so that we can think about, what does a writer get from this? This is after Kate Chopin has found out her husband has died, and she's in the room by herself thinking about this. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. Here we're getting the character's thoughts about her husband's death. And because this is a very personal, very intimate story, we are learning that maybe her husband's death wasn't such a bad thing. She would have later years where she would have what we find out in the last line here, freedom. And yet she loved him. Sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. There's a plotting here, a way that Chopin is bringing us into this story, into this woman's head, so that we can understand why it's maybe not such a bad thing that your husband dies. Which, of course, leads us into the end of this story, where we find out her husband's not dead, but then the character herself dies out of shock, out of sadness. The way that Chopin creates the story in just a few paragraphs It makes us experience the entire world in this woman's head, lets us learn how to write a story. And when we read a lot of stories, we learn about how to craft our own. This comes from the Love in the Time of COVID-19. I love you without knowing how or when this pandemic will end. I love you carefully with double masking. I love you like this because we can't quarantine forever in the shelter of social distancing, so close that your viral load is mine, so close that your curve rises with my cough. It's a really beautiful last line. And I share this poem with you as a way of thinking about you may never have thought about writing about the love of masking, the love of quarantine, or the love of COVID. Maybe that connection never occurred to you, but reading this poem, it just seems natural. And this is what reading does for a writer. It allows us to see the ways that other writers make connections. It allows us to learn how those connections are made and then maybe become a little more creative with our own connections. I'll share with you two poems here. First is from Mary Oliver. She writes, "The wren from California, or I'm sorry, from Carolina. A wren is a type of bird. Just now the wren from Carolina buzzed through the neighbor's hedge, a line of grace notes I couldn't even write down, much less sing. Now he lifts his chestnut-colored throat and delivers such a cantering praise. For what? For the early morning, the taste of the spider, for his small cup of life that he drinks from every day, knowing it will refill. All things are inventions of holiness, some more rascally than others. I'm on that list too, though I don't know exactly where. But every morning there is my cup of gladness, and there's that wren in the hedge above me with his blazing song." I love Mary Oliver's poetry as a writer, but also as a poetry reader. I love to hear the ways that she brings in nature and her own cynicism about nature and her life, but also how she continually finds beauty in that nature. And Mary Oliver inspired me to write my own poem. Now, Mary Oliver often writes about nature. I often write about my children because they drive me crazy. So I've got a poem called What Makes Us Purple. And I want to just show you how this poem on the left, I can't remember if this is the exact wren poem because she likes to write about nature and wrens. If this is the exact one that inspired me, or if it was another one, but this poem on the left inspired the poem on the right. What Makes Us Purple? In the middle of Mary Oliver being Mary Oliver, the wrens and faith in the wrens, that spirituality that refuses name, the dog ate crayons and the 4-year-old started laughing. The 6-year-old, meanwhile, was throwing pillows across the room as if they were lightning bolts cast at unbelievers. He is angry again because the world is making him sick. And Daddy sighs, losing Oliver's poem between breathing waves. Mary Oliver, I believe, has never lost a line while yelling at the 4-year-old that the dog is going to shit purple. It will be a purple, in fact, purpler than his brother's face after he has realized the state of things. You can use your reading to find new spaces of writing as long as you give the time to that reading. And I would argue that in order, especially as a younger writer, and I'm not talking about age there, as somebody who's just starting to explore your creative voice, your balance of reading and writing should be fairly equal. You should be spending a lot of time exploring the types of things that you like to read, the types of things you don't like to read. As our handout said, you should be exploring what it means to read as a writer. One of the very first books that inspired me was Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. I was probably 15 when I read this. Now, I'd been inspired by many other books before that, but I want to share with you a little passage of this book. This book is about two boys who find this magical carnival and who find adventure and fantasy world within this carnival. I want to read to you a little bit from this book. This comes from the start of chapter 2. It kind of just captures these boys' friendship. There's nothing in the living world like books on water cures, or death of 1,000 slices, or pouring white hot lava off castle walls on drolls and mountebanks. So said Jim Nightshade. That's all he read. If it wasn't how to burgle the First National Bank, it was how to build catapults or shape black bumbershoots into lurking bat costumes for cabbage night. Jim breathed it all out fine. And Will, he breathed it in. With the lightning rod nailed to Jim's roof, Will proud and Jim ashamed of what he considered mutual cowardice, it was late in the day. Supper over, it was time for their weekly jog to the library. Like all boys, they never walked anywhere, but named a goal and lit for it. Scissors and elbows. Nobody won. Nobody wanted to win. It was in their friendship that they just wanted to run forever, shadow and shadow. Their hands slapped the library door's handles together. Their chests broke the track tapes together. Their tennis shoes beat parallel pony tracks over lawns, trimmed bushes, squirreled trees, no one losing, both winning, thus saving their friendship for other times of loss. So it was on this night that blew warm, then cool, as they let the wind take them downtown at 8 o'clock. They felt the wings on their fingers and elbows flying, then suddenly plunged into new sweeps of air. The clear autumn river flung them headlong where they must go. Up steps 3, 6, 9, 12, slap! Their palms hit the library door. Jim and Will grinned at each other. It was all so good, these blowing, quiet October nights, and the library waiting inside now with its green shaded lapes and papyrus dust. Ray Bradbury brought me into his story and made me feel this story where I've never wanted to stop reading. He was creating an entire world in the story that made it come alive in my brain. And now, as an adult, as a writer, going back and looking at this, I can start to explore ways that Bradbury made that happen. But more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, another thing I can do with this is I can use Bradbury's writing as inspiration for my own. I can create my own writing on the basis of what I read there. So I'm about to give you 4 ways that you could do that with this text. Here are 4 prompts. You could do one of these for your writing journal this week. Just grab this one little slice and see where it takes you. Write about running with your best friend when you were 13. Describe the feeling of walking into a library as a child who loves books. Make us feel an early fall evening when you are young and free and vibrant. Create an early teen character who is just beginning to explore the wonder of the world on her own. What is she doing? What does she see? Try grabbing one of these. I'm going to put this PowerPoint on our Moodle page. Try grabbing one of these and seeing where it takes you. Take the prompt, explore it, think about it, maybe do a little bit of brainstorming, and then try to meet the prompt. Your reading will allow you to create worlds, not just for you, but for your readers. And that is one of the most important things to get here. The idea that our writing exists in a world of reading. And when we read, we honor the place our writing goes. You cannot be a participant in that world without knowing what's happening in it. And in order to really honor your own writing, you have to honor the writing that's already out there. Be a reader. Be a writer who reads, who builds your own world.